Gentlemen, thank you. Thanks for the work that you're doing. Thanks for standing up for the laws of the United States. You don't hear enough, and so let me add a voice that I hear a lot in my state of people that are incredibly grateful for the work that's happening and understand we have laws in our country, and you and your teams are stepping up and enforcing the laws that are on the books. So thank you for doing that. I listened to some of the current debate nationally, and there is a move to be able to transition DHS to being more like greeters at the border than they are law enforcement at the border. And I'm grateful that we have law enforcement folks there and for the stories that you've already told about some of the dangers and the risks that are there. I've got a whole series of questions, but I want to start first on talking about with ICE. When I was down at the border this last July, and talking to CBP folks that were there and said, what do you need? The very first thing that most of them said is, we need ICE to get more funding. We need ICE help. They are doing soft-sided facilities, which I want to be able to speak to you about where we are on that status right now. But there was a pretty big push to say that the biggest issue that CBP has is not enough capacity with ICE. So understand there's some battles. There's a whole group of folks saying they want to abolish ICE or defund ICE and not have it at all. But what do you need at this point to greater be able to manage a surge of people coming at us next summer?
So two things, Senator. Number one, detention beds, detention capacity is a really big issue that affects the whole ecosystem of enforcement of our immigration laws. And as Commissioner Morgan can attest, these are the funding levels of beds, for example, in fiscal year 19 was 45,000 and change, including 2,500 beds for FRCs, the family residential centers. We were operating at a high of almost 58,000, well over our appropriate levels. And of course, we do want to live within our means. However, the operational reality and responding to the crisis really forced us to make some decisions about how to acquire more beds.
Do you have the capability to be able to surge up numbers if you were given additional funding to be able to do that? As far as the locations, facilities that are quality facilities, what they're managing right now on the border when they had up to 20,000 people with 4,000 bed capacity, they're trying to be able to manage. They're not going to just release people on the street, which we thank you for doing that, to be able to help manage what you get. But do you have the capability at ICE to be able to surge facilities up?
Yes, sir, and I think, and we won't bring a bed online unless it meets all of our high standards for ICE. So we won't. So sometimes the challenge in identifying beds is making sure that they meet the standards that we're committed to putting detainees into. And I'll say one sort of example of some proactive planning would be the ability to have a certain number of beds available and empty in almost like an emergency preparedness posture. So like FEMA, for example, stores supplies and assets and things that they would need to respond to a natural disaster. We should have 5,000 beds that are ready to go to immediately address a spike in numbers at the border. And so those beds, that's going to cost money, but they're empty and they're available and they're ready to go in the case of an emergency.
So let me push that cost money. Do you have a guess of what that might be on cost? Have y'all started looking at that?
I do have estimates, Senator, and I'm happy to provide those to you or actually come.
Glad to be able to talk about that, because let me switch over. The soft-sided facilities that CBP had to do to be able to ramp up, to be able to manage the capacity, they're around $200 million a year to be able to rent. That's a pretty big cost on it, but there was no place to be able to ramp up. What's the status on those? How many facilities, soft-sided facilities, do we have? I visited some of those facilities. They're great facilities, and they're well-managed, they're well-run, they're fully stocked. How many of those do we still have, and what's the capacity in those soft-sided facilities?
So we still have multiple facilities, and depending on what they are. So we have facilities that are designed for families. We have facilities designed for single adults, and we also have facilities for the temporary hearing facilities to support MPP. It is costing a tremendous amount of money every single month. You and I have talked about this, sir. What I'm concerned about, though, is I don't want to look up the definition of insanity in the dictionary and have a picture of a soft-sided facility. Yeah. We have to change how we do this. this. And I think Acting Deputy Director Benner said it best, we need a surge capacity. And so what we're looking bipartisan support in the future is to establish permanent hard-side facilities in strategic locations along the southwest border that are multi-use, multi-purpose buildings that it gives us that capability to instantaneously turn on the lights and give us that surge capacity. So one, we're not in a position we were this year where we did have to release individuals into the cities and towns, tens of thousands on a regular basis, and we're avoiding the definition of insanity of just having to ramp up soft-side facilities only to tear them down again.
That's great. Mr. Benner.
Senator, so this year, ICE had 503,000 bookings into custody. 75% of those were from CBP. So, you know, ERO and ICE and the infrastructure of transportation and all of those efforts were doing their level best to relieve the pressure at the border for Commissioner Morgan's folks. There's one other aspect, though, here is on the other end of the equation is attorneys that represent the government in immigration court. And so while it's been hugely helpful to have more judges and more capacity for EOIR, the ICE attorney levels have remained flat. And so with that docket of around 1 million at any given point, we need to look at the ability to surge our attorney population to service the increase at EOIR. Okay. And I think that's a hand in glove kind of asset.
They have to all go together.
Yes.
Mr. Cuccinelli, let me ask you a question. I stood a raid in Mississippi this past year that got a lot of publicity on that. And I think, Mr. Benner, you had mentioned that for ICE in the interior picking up, 86% of those folks that were picked up had a criminal record already. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So that's important to be able to note, 86% of the folks that already have a criminal record on this. When ICE carried out that raid, there was a lot of questions because E-Verify is mandatory in Mississippi, yet there were hundreds of people there that were not legally present that had employment in Mississippi. So help us understand, when in states that have chosen to do E-Verify as mandatory, how we have that many people illegally employed there.
Thank you, Senator. So in the instance of the operations that ICE executed there in Mississippi at a number of different locations, you had multiple companies claiming to be participants in E-Verify, and they had registered with E-Verify. But when we investigated with our partners at ICE how many of the individuals they had utilized E-Verify on, it literally came to a handful, less than 20 if recollection serves. And you know the hundreds that were identified by ICE as working there illegally. So we have instituted for the first time, a consequence for businesses who participate in E-Verify or nominally participate in E-Verify, but do not comply with the terms of that participation, such as the businesses in Mississippi would be an example, that we will terminate them from the E-Verify program. So for the first time, we're bringing a consequence to those businesses so they cannot shield, as they did. You heard in the press, they said, oh, well, we use E-Verify. Right, we used it once last year on one guy. And they can't do that any longer.
Okay, thank you.